Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Maccarelli, and I'm a sophomore Kevin D. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. This past year marked the Institute's 20th anniversary, founded just days before the September 11th attacks. The Institute has faithfully served the college and community by promoting civic engagement, education, and empowerment to citizens of all ages. Tonight, we are delighted to host Outlook 2022, featuring Leah Askarinon, Nathaniel Rakic, and Sarah Frostenstein, who will guide us through a conversation, sharing their perspectives on the upcoming 2022 midterm elections. After the discussion, we will have two students coming around with the microphone for audience questions. Please wait for the microphone before asking your question. Leah Askarinon is a graduate of Tulane University and is currently the co-author of the On Politics newsletter at the New York Times. She is a highly experienced journalist, being the previous editor-in-chief of the National Journal's Hotline and having spent time as an editor with The Atlantic before that. Nathaniel Rakic is a graduate of the prestigious Harvard University and has served on Harvard's graduate board for nearly a decade. He is very well versed in the field of political science and elections and is currently a senior election analyst for 538, a position which he has held for nearly 4 years now. Rakic previously worked as a senior political analyst at the Atlas Project, a DC-based political organization focused on the progressive movement, and he also wrote about politics and baseball on his blog Base Ballot, where he combined two of his most captivating interests. Sarah Frostenstein is a graduate with high honors of Dartmouth College and has been in the field of journalism for over a decade. She has been the politics editor for 538 for 4 years now, where she identifies potential stories, shapes pitches, and edits writers. She has previously spent time covering politics and elections with Vox Media, USA Today, and Politico. Together, these three honorable guests will help guide us through discussion on the outlook of the 2022 midterm elections, focusing on who the winners, the losers, and everybody in between will be, and why they'll ultimately end up there. Please join me in warmly welcoming Leah Askarinon, Nathaniel Rakic, and Sarah Frostenstein to the Institute. Thank you.
So glad to see you guys. To see you. Well, this is great. It's so wonderful to be back in the post-face mask world of COVID in front of all of you and having our three great guests today. We're going to get right started and start talking about these midterm elections, which are obviously so important with a 50-50 Senate, control of the House. And so, Nathaniel, I'll start with you. If you could just sort of give us a broad overview of some of these states and where things look like right now.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is fun. Hello, everybody. I guess, well, so for the Senate, I guess, is, it's the easiest thing to start with. The House is redistricted and, we still don't know some of the seats. But, I think that the focus in the Senate is going to be on four kind of vulnerable Democratic-held seats. So you have Georgia and Arizona, which of course Democrats won in 2020 with Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock in special elections, and they're back up again this year, and it's going to be probably a much more challenging environment for them without kind of Biden's coattails, and in fact in a probably Republican-leaning midterm year, given that Biden's unpopular now. And then you also have Nevada, and you have New Hampshire, of course, a state you folks may have heard of. And because obviously Democrats only have their kind of 50-50 advantage, they really need to run the table probably. They have maybe a couple of pickup opportunities in, like I think Pennsylvania would be their best shot, maybe also Wisconsin. Pennsylvania is an open seat where Pat Toomey is retiring from, and that's probably the bluest seat that the Republicans currently hold that Democrats could actually offset a loss in like a Georgia or an Arizona. And then Wisconsin is Senator Ron Johnson, who is running for re-election. We can maybe talk about whether he's a strong incumbent or not. I tend to think he's not. He's kind of been, had kind of 9 lives politically. He ran in 2010. He was a businessman and kind of upset Russ Feingold, who was a kind of a well-known senator at the time. But because that was such a red year, he was able to do that. In 2016, everybody wrote him off for dead, and of course, everybody also thought that Trump was going to lose Wisconsin, and again, kind of Republicans did better than expected, and he's back this year, and Democrats hope to take him down. He's kind of had some more fringier, I would say, stances on things like vaccines and everything. And then you also have like North Carolina, maybe Florida as potential Democratic pickup opportunities, but I think then you're getting into states that even Biden didn't carry in 2020, so I think it's unlikely that Democrats will make, will be able to score a win there in what's likely to be a worse year for them.
So Sarah, is it your prediction that it'll flip? And if it flips, how much of a swing? I don't mean to put you on the spot as an exact number, but what is, what would be considered a red wave year, and what would really be something that the Republicans could say, we won the midterm elections?
Well, stay tuned for our predictions. It's a little early in the cycle at this point. You can expect forecasts for the House, Senate, Governor later this summer. Essentially for a red wave, it's interesting. In political science, there's not really one definition for it. Even though in 2018, that was, something we covered as a blue wave, didn't meet at least one political scientist threshold. It was like 50 seats was necessary for it to be considered a wave election. One thing that will be really interesting going into this cycle in particular is redistricting, as we've covered. Nathaniel had an article on this last week at 538 talking about how the bias towards the GOP in the House will actually be the lowest it's been in decades, meaning that it's not a level playing field. And Nathaniel can talk more about that, individual states and the challenges there. But it will actually be kind of hard for Republicans to pick up some ground. I think the biggest thing to watch there will be the seats where Democrats are running that Biden won, right? Or, it was a close margin in 2020 and how they fare this coming year. So, I think a bigger question will kind of be, do the House and Senate move in the same direction? They didn't in the 2018 midterms. Could they here in 2020? What would it mean then for a Democratic president, a Republican-controlled Congress, gridlock for the next 2 years moving forward? Yeah.
So one state you didn't mention, Leah, is New Hampshire. And what I interpreted from your answer, Sarah, is that candidate recruitment is very important, especially in the Senate. But here in New Hampshire, Sununu has decided not to run for the Senate. What do you see on the prospects and the issues here that are affecting the Senate race, and whether or not that's a winnable seat for the Republicans?
I think it's clearly winnable. It just became much more difficult when Chris Sununu decided not to run. That would have basically prevented Republicans from having to engage in a primary. And as we've seen in other states across the country, mostly Ohio, if anyone's been following that Senate primary, get a sense of how nasty these can get, especially when there's a lot of jockeying around for Trump's endorsement. And then from there, when somebody has Trump's endorsement, doing the, no, but I'm still more like Trump anyway. If Chris Sununu had decided to run, I think that we would see Republicans get away without having to engage in a primary in New Hampshire, which would have prevented candidates from going too far right. I was very surprised personally when he made the announcement. I audibly gasped alone in my kitchen, which I like to think 4 other people in the country probably did. We were all texting
Mitch
each other.
McConnell was one of them, though.
I know. I wasn't texting.
I think they were all in this building, all 4.
No, I think we're just seeing across the board that governors, if you've been a governor, it's kind of hard to imagine reshaping your life around Washington. The Senate is going to be a tough place. It's already a tough place to work. Now imagine what it's going to look like in 2023. We have primaries in Missouri and Ohio where I think you're going to find that Republican senators don't want to work with some of these people who end up winning. And I think it's prevented Republicans from recruiting some top candidates in places like Maryland, Arizona, New Hampshire, probably elsewhere that I'm not thinking of right now. All that said, that might make their lives easier. Having really good recruitment doesn't mean that, New Hampshire is still competitive. It's almost just as competitive. It's just going to look very different from how, it could have been a much smoother process, if that makes sense.
So Sarah, Leah mentioned the T word, Trump. And obviously he's having a huge impact with his endorsements. You know, we call him the Mar-a-Lago influence at this point. He will make some endorsements. How big do you think that's going to be? And name some states where you think that that's crucial.
Well, that's a great question. You know, earlier, well, actually not earlier this year, at the end of last year, Nathaniel and our intern on staff at the time had looked to see, you know, okay, what do Trump's endorsements look like this year? We had known from, you know, 2018, he had a high track record in terms of people he endorsed getting elected. 2020, he seemed to pad his record more, making more safe bets. We noticed here going into the 2022 midterms, he was endorsing earlier. His endorsements were bolder in terms of both like Secretary of State, Attorney General, down ballot races that normally, you know, a former president doesn't really enter the fray to endorse. And he would also just announced a lot more than he had previously. You know, without giving too much away, a piece we're working on currently is looking at, he has now kind of slowed down. He's taken some back, said, JK, never mind. And it seems to increasingly, which I think was true, and we saw this at the end of last year, but his endorsements have kind of become, you know, a test of loyalty. You know, do you have his back 100%? One thing we're tracking in races is candidates who espouse the big lie, both, you know, fundamentally saying the election was stolen, but then also kind of like big lie adjacent, where it's just, you know, coded words around election integrity and wanting, you know, security in elections. And that's very widespread. And in terms of states, though, where it could really matter, I mean, you know, Leah was getting at this earlier with, you know, both Missouri, Ohio, you know, candidates in that race are all trying to prove, you know, how Trumpy they are. His endorsement could have a lot of power there. It's interesting to see that, you know, Portman endorsed in Ohio. I'm curious now for what that will mean in that race. I'm trying to think, are there other big?
Pennsylvania, maybe.
Yeah.
And just trying to think about any states where you look at the polling right now and it's just like a jumble at like leader has 15% of the vote. So, you know, yeah, like in Pennsylvania you have this, basically the primary looks like it's between Dr. Oz and this wealthy businessman, David McCormick. Also for Pennsylvania governor, that's a wide open race, and somebody who actually was at the January 6th riot is one of the front runners there in the Republican primary. So if Trump endorses him, you know, that could be you know, an actual, you know, the governor of Pennsylvania, or at least the Republican nominee for that could be a kind of an insurrectionist, which would be interesting. And then, yeah, so, and then the other thing I wanted to say also based on what Sarah said is, yeah, like Secretary of State races I think are a really important part of this. I think in a lot of these down ballot races that haven't gotten a lot of attention historically, but maybe Trump is putting the attention on it, or at least putting the Republican base's attention on it. You know, in the past, the Secretary of State's race, maybe somebody, whoever just had the most money or the most name recognition would win. But, you know, in this case, the only thing a lot of voters are going to know about, you know, a Secretary of State candidate as opposed to Senate, which is a much more high-profile race, is like, where does Trump stand on this race? You know, does this person support the idea that the 2020 election was stolen? And of course, Secretary of State in most states is the office that runs elections and will have the power to kind of put a thumb on the scale for the 2024 elections. Who, you know, the Secretaries of State who are elected here in 2022 will oversee the 2024 elections. And I think that, you know, especially in some red states where the primary is the de facto general election, you know, if Trump endorses some Secretary of State candidates and then they end up winning, you know, that could be, you know, a lot of the kind of nightmare scenario that we avoided in 2020 of kind of the election being subverted could end up coming to pass in 2024. So
Leah, I'll stay on the same theme, because here in New Hampshire, we're looking at the presidential primary. We've got a president who may or may not run for re-election. That's a big question mark, and whether or not there'll be a fight on that side, particularly with the outcome of these elections that we're discussing. But also, will Trump run again? And what do you think the influence of him in these midterm elections, and how will that influence his decision? Not to have you read his mind, but
no, it's so tricky because it's hard to overstate Trump's power, and it's also hard to understate his power. Like when he endorses, he creates a floor for these candidates. So if there's a 10-person primary in a Texas House race and Trump endorses one of them, like what we saw in a special election earlier this year, that candidate automatically rockets to the top too. But that might be with less than 30% of the vote. So what does that mean if it's a one-on-one race? You kind of get these people who have, the Trump endorsement gets you a kind of a minimum in order to be credible, but we don't know if it really gets you over that hump to actually win. So right now we're seeing Republicans clearly believe that Trump is the key to these victories. So you're seeing across the board Republicans, basically repeating Trump's talking points, trying to get his endorsement. You will not see very many Republican Senate or House candidates create any distance between themselves and the president. But I don't really know if Trump's endorsed candidates are going to do very well in 2022. In Alaska, Kelly Tshibaka has not been a magnificent fundraiser, but really what's probably preventing her from taking off is this top 4 primary system. We just saw Lisa Murkowski saying she's going to vote in favor of Judge Jackson on the Supreme Court. You can see her potentially consolidating some Democratic and independent votes. So that's just one. He just rescinded his endorsement of Mo Brooks, a campaign that was really never taking off. We've seen in Pennsylvania, his candidate dropped out. And now I guess he's going to re-endorse. So, I mean, he's Republicans and I think the general political establishment all feel that Trump is a major player, and he is, but I don't know how impactful that is, if that,
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing, Sarah alluded to this when she said that Trump's endorsements were bolder, but he's really endorsing, in the past he's padded his record by basically endorsing a bunch of incumbents, a bunch of frontrunners. This year he's endorsing a lot of candidates who maybe are underdogs, and in fact he's endorsed against a lot of incumbents, for example. So he's endorsed Harriet Hageman's challenge to Liz Cheney in Wyoming. Other folks, he endorsed Jeff Deal for governor of Massachusetts before when he was running against Charlie Baker, which, well, maybe with Trump's endorsement he would have done well, but endorsing against an incumbent governor and a very popular one at that, these are risky picks. So I think you're exactly right, Leah. It's hard to overstate and hard to understate. Like, I still think Trump is powerful in the party. I still think his endorsement rate is going to be really good. I don't think it's going to be 98%, which is literally what it was in 2020.
Yeah, I'm curious if it'll be good. It's like, as you were saying, it's also like the petty primary. He's just going after the challengers to take on incumbents who've, upset him in some way. And I think it's not a prediction, but I think we will see mixed signals where someone like Cheney could still lose in Wyoming, but then Kemp will win in Georgia. Yeah. It's all over the place, and I think you are seeing Republicans kind of grapple with to what extent they want to embrace Trump still within the party. And you saw a model within Youngkin in Virginia, Trump did endorse him, but Youngkin was very much like, please stay in the shadows. And that's one path forward for the Republican Party. It's not the only path, though.
So you mentioned Youngkin's. He's obviously someone that I think a lot of candidates will probably emulate. What's the secret to Youngkin's? Besides what you just mentioned, it's like a non-offensive thing, and tie into that, what are some of the issues that we're going to see that are winners? So what are both parties sort of honing in on as issues?
Great. Well, I'm very curious for Leah's perspective on this, covering campaigns more granularly than we do. But for Youngkin, and I think for Republicans like him, you're pushed to the right in the primary. You have to appeal to that base, and that base meaning, the low turnout propensity voter that Trump really energized in 2016 and 2020. And that is kind of like we've been calling it anti-establishmentarianism as kind of the spectrum they're moving on. Maybe they listen to maybe they listen to Joe Rogan. Maybe, they are actually a little populist, though, when it comes to the economy. They're a weird voter who isn't necessarily small c conservative and how we have traditionally thought of the Republican Party, right? Sorry, where else you were asked?
I think that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
hop in.
That. Like, Chris Sununu is the Glenn Youngkin playbook. Like they always get kind of like, whenever people credit Glenn Youngkin, it's like, have you guys been watching New Hampshire? Like this is what he's been doing for the last, I mean, he's so good at the, picking Trump up, or meeting Trump at the airport, but not going to the rally. Like just giving enough respect to Donald Trump where he doesn't engage in the petty primary, which I'm going to steal and use all the time. But not so much that he's turning off Trump's base. And Glenn Youngkin took that to a whole other level in terms of making sure that events were local and having surrogates come in. And Donald Trump, according to I think Washington Post reporting, was kind of on the phone with Glenn Youngkin during parts of this, but not engaging publicly, which I just think is the Chris Sununu playbook. And we aren't seeing a lot of candidates emulate that in 2022. That might change after the primaries, but Glenn Youngkin didn't have a real primary. He had, it was a convention with delegates, and I don't think it was totally an accident that it was a convention with delegates, because there was a woman running who was self-described Trump in heels, who could have made things more difficult for Republicans in the general election. A lot of what Glenn Youngkin did, and if you just kind of follow the polling throughout the campaign, and Nathaniel, if you disagree with this, I really want to know, because this is my take on the polling. Glenn Youngkin was kind of in the mid-40 range, like a little bit below McAuliffe, Democrat Terry McAuliffe, throughout most of the cycle. And then Biden's numbers dropped in August and July. And right around then is when Youngkin started to take off. So Youngkin kind of, he allowed the national environment to lift him. And if Biden's numbers hadn't gone down, or if the election had been 4 months before, I don't know if Glenn Youngkin would have been governor.
I think that's right. Like, yeah, I think, I think a lot of the time people try to put a reason on these things, and they try to be like, oh, what did Glenn Youngkin do well? Was it the sweater vest? Was it, like education and critical race theory? But yeah, I'm very much like on the kind of fundamentalist side of things, which is that like, no, he just, rode this, discontent with Biden and got lucky with, the fact that people kind of soured on the president, and you saw basically the same kind of thing happen in New Jersey. And it didn't get headlines because, the Democrats still won in New Jersey, because New Jersey is a bluer state than Virginia is. But basically the same like 10-point shift away from Biden and toward Republicans happened in New Jersey. So I think that's a sign that this is really just due to national trends, the national mood, rather than, Glenn Youngkin being a particular genius at campaigning. Even though I think everything that you said about, I agree that, the Chris Sununu playbook thing is savvy, but I don't think it's really what made the difference for him.
No, I think Republicans don't want, they need the national environment to lift them. Right. And they can't get in the way of
exactly.
that. And yeah. Glenn Youngkin didn't get in the way. Right. He didn't have a big scandal. Yep. He didn't have a big gaffe. Like he just, and that's the risk, is which of these candidates says the wrong thing and becomes a national story, and does that matter?
That's fair, but I do think, as much as a president's approval rating is tied to how his party performs in the midterms, it's worth unpacking, like, why is Biden's number so bad? It's net negative 12 at the moment.
Yeah.
And so, I think we saw within Virginia, and I think it's a really good point, though, that like Virginia, New Jersey, same day, education doesn't get any attention in the New Jersey race, and yet, it's still a really close governor's race there, right? There have been analyses looking at like what role did COVID restrictions play in Virginia. They had some of the toughest in the nation. What did that mean for counties where schools were closed? Those are really hard analyses to do because, the New York Times actually done a piece recently looking at, when you ask Americans about their feelings on education, some of the people with the strongest opinions are those who don't have kids in school right now. So it's like, education is a culture war issue, right? It is also tainted by what has happened with COVID-19. Both of those are tied up together. It's not just critical race theory. It's not just, COVID restrictions. It's this muddy complicated brew of the two of them. And honestly, the fact that right now for Americans, COVID-19 is not the top priority. They're more concerned about the economy and inflation, and that's something traditionally Republicans have been seen to handle better. That's winning over independent voters who had started to move away from Biden in April. It obviously accelerated with Afghanistan over the summer, but it just hasn't recovered. And I do think, you know, it's not just the issues driving it, as Nathaniel and Leah are saying, but it is kind of worth unpacking what issues are, you know, driving it, and then which party is kind of better positioned to, you know, play that to their advantage.
We just did a poll here, and the country is on the wrong track, according to 68% of New Hampshire voters, down from 74, being a high number.
Okay.
Yeah, and Biden's numbers are terrible, but that also includes a certain segment of Democrats and very liberal people who are not happy as well. And maybe part of this is, you know, he did not win New Hampshire presidential primary. He didn't really compete. He wasn't a good communicator, and he's not able to sort of communicate and change this message. So I'm looking to see what are the winning issues, and how does a Maggie Hassan or a candidate out west who's a Democrat get around Biden's numbers and that wrong track number? What are the key issues? You start to hear Hassan in particular, the words big oil has come out of her mouth 100 times in the past week, so that must be a winning thing. What are the big things where you think that they can skirt around Biden's numbers and potentially win? What are the issues?
Okay.
That doesn't make you feel good if you're a Democrat.
I can tell you what they're starting to talk about. There are two kind of competing narratives in these introductory ads from Democrats. One is things are terrible right now, and we're here to help, and I'm sympathetic and empathetic and all those things. And the other is things are great. And we're seeing those especially in governor's ads, and it could work in those governor's races, because governor's races are different from Senate races. People know, voters do know that voting for the governor means you're voting for a person, and voting for Senate means you're voting for control of Congress, regardless of whether you like the candidate or not. So I'm seeing those two as kind of big issues. I'm also hearing people talk about pushing for tax cuts, basically anything that can localize the race as much as possible. So in Arizona, that might be talking about protecting veterans, and in New Hampshire, it could be big oil, apparently. I think it just depends on the state. In general, what you're going to see is, you know, Democrats have made things better. And that's, I think, the general narrative in House and Senate races.
Sarah, what about a court strike on Roe versus Wade hitting in June?
Yeah, it was NBC who had released a poll, I believe, earlier this week, making the bold claim that, right, you know, if Roe was overturned, that would dramatically shift the election and energize Democratic voters. It's complicated. Obviously, you know, a Supreme Court precedent of that, you know, nature has not been overturned recently, and how that would affect an election moving forward. You know, I do think we should go into that with eyes open. We did know, for instance, in the 2018 midterms, Kavanaugh's nomination to the court, it motivated Republican voters to turn out against Republicans who had voted against Kavanaugh. We saw that in McCaskill's race in particular in Missouri, Heitkamp in North Dakota. And so while abortion, you know, there's kind of two camps in that, where it's long been a motivating issue among evangelical Christians on the right. It has increasingly, though, been a motivating issue for Democrats. I think where people kind of disagree, and there's like areas of gray there, is that it's a question of how much, you know, is that really the top issue for Democrats moving forward? They just traditionally, the court has not been as much of a motivating factor. I think, though, you know, we've seen in recent public opinion polls that Americans view the court as a more partisan actor than they have traditionally. Still gets higher approval ratings than Congress, but that's not much. That's already, you know, 20% or less, which is not great. So yeah, I don't think we can discount Roe. The part of me that's skeptical is like, will that be the issue that drives Democrats forward? Because I think, as we were kind of getting at earlier, there's this divide within the Democratic Party and strategy too of like, go to the middle, that's the only way to win. Or no, keep going left, the Democratic Party has failed to do X, Y, Z. And so what you're seeing then is like a very liberal base that's unsatisfied, who maybe turned out in 2020 was energized, is not going to turn out in 2022. But then also what happens to those independent voters or those voters who are more moderate Democrats? That's still a large component of the base as well.
And they don't seem to shift. So in our poll, again, 59% said that they would like to see a switch on the decision on the Keystone Pipeline. So they've obviously linked that to high gas prices. But you don't see any kind of a shift within the Biden White House to do that, or really any tangible thing that would sort of alleviate inflation or gas prices.
Right, yeah, no, there isn't anything at present for that. And I think it's kind of a question right now. Harry Enton, who once worked at 538, had a piece for CNN recently kind of walking through, interest right now in Ukraine, even though it's the top news story, and it's truly a devastation for what's happening there. People are starting to tune it out, and that's essentially what's kind of bought Biden. In some ways, it's like we were talking about how bad Biden's approval number is right now, and it is bad, but in theory, it should be much worse given where inflation is. But there has been a lot, when you ask Americans in polls, like gas prices are high, but do you understand it's because, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Americans say yes, and they say I support it because of that. But that's going to have a shelf life. I think we've all been surprised by how long that war has gone on in Ukraine. Initially, when Putin invaded, the media largely thought that it'd be a matter of days, weeks, and it's now very clear that this is like trench warfare and is going to last a long time. Americans don't have an appetite for that, and so the question, if we're not going to intervene in Ukraine and the situation stays contained there, and the gas prices still at home remain high, and people's wages aren't keeping up with inflation, people are self-interested at heart, and that is going to be a hard thing for Democrats to spin positively.
Nathaniel, I want to shift gears just a little bit because you did write this article, and the gerrymandering subject is fascinating, and the fact that I think probably a lot of people don't understand that what you found as far as the two parties go, and if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, definitely. So redistricting, for folks who don't know, is the process every 10 years after you do the census. You have to redraw the lines of not only Congress, but state legislatures and city councils and everything on down the ballot to make sure that those districts have the right number of people, that every congressional district has the same number of people, et cetera. And so we've been tracking redistricting at 538. You can visit our tracker if you go to 538.com/redistricting, #ad. That process is almost complete. There are only 3 states that have not finished drawing their congressional seats. We are sitting in one of them.
Get it together.
I know, right? Come on, guys, get with the program. But yeah, so we are probably at the point though where kind of the overall national takeaway is possible. And so I would kind of thread a needle here and say that, as Sarah mentioned, the House map, which historically has been quite biased in favor of Republicans, which is both due to their gerrymandering, but also just kind of the patterns in the way that people live. Rural areas tend to be given outsized sway in our electoral system, and of course, rural areas tend to vote Republican. So basically, historically, the House has had this bias of as much as 5 or 6 percentage points, which basically means that theoretically, Democrats have needed to win the popular vote by 5 or 6 points in order to have a chance at winning a majority of the seats. It looks like now the bias in the House is going to be about 1 point toward Republicans, which is about as close to a fair map as you've had in several decades. So everything seems like it's great, right? There's no bias in the House and there's no gerrymandering anymore. No, that is not true. The reason that these maps are, that the overall national map is balanced is that Democrats have engaged in gerrymandering of their own, and basically they have come to a level of parity with Republicans in that regard. It's kind of like a stalemate. And so if you look at the individual congressional maps, you see we have a few different metrics for measuring how gerrymandered a map is, like efficiency gap, and you see time and time again, you have several states where these metrics are just completely off the charts. That, means that in addition, a lot of like competitive seats have been drawn out of existence. So I think on our tracker right now, we're down 5 or 6 competitive seats nationally, and we were already at a point where competitive seats are basically at the lowest point they've been at in decades. Again, that's not entirely because of gerrymandering, it's because people have gotten more kind of polarized in their, and entrenched in their voting intentions. But it's certainly not a trend that gerrymandering has helped. You also see things like, there's not only partisan gerrymandering, but there is also racial gerrymandering, and a lot of opportunities to give more representation to communities of color have been passed by. So you had several southern states that could have drawn an additional district where black voters would make up a majority, so places like Alabama, Louisiana. They declined to do that this year. There was a whole court case about it. It's now before the Supreme Court. Texas is a state where they gained 2 congressional districts, mostly due to the growth of people of color and Latinos, and the 2 new districts that they added are both majority white seats. So basically the takeaway from redistricting this year is that it's created an evenly balanced House map, and for the purposes of the 2022 elections, it looks like, it's not like, it seems likely that the party that wins the national popular vote will win the House, which is good for democracy. But that doesn't mean that the maps are fair or that we don't kind of have this gerrymandering problem that has been with us for a long time.
Gerrymandering, a wonderful thing brought to us by the state of Massachusetts, by the way. No offense.
That's fair. Guilty as charged.
So we're going to take questions, but I'll just shoot a question to anyone who wants to answer it first. The generic ballot, 46, 42 here, leaning Republican, we haven't seen that. How important do you think that is, or is it more the personality of the individual candidates that you think weighs more heavily? Sorry to throw that at you.
Oh no, that's everything. And that's not everything, but that is by far the most important thing. I will say, in our average of 538, the Republicans currently only have a 2-point advantage. I do think that will widen for somewhat wonky reasons, which I guess I can go through. So so historically that's happened, that it's moved away from the president's party, but especially when there's a Democrat in the White House, when those polls go from being registered voter polls to likely voter polls, that kind of kicks in this kind of double advantage for Republicans, which is they have the enthusiasm advantage right now, and likely voters in midterms are more likely to be older and whiter, and those tend to be Republican demographics. So I would guess that the final generic ballot will be significantly redder than R+2. But I do think that to like Leah's point earlier, there are things that candidates can do. I think that certain candidates, like maybe Eric Greitens in Missouri, although Missouri is so red that it may not make a difference, but clearly I think you'd see a penalty for some of these candidates who have really been accused of very serious allegations, sexual assault in his case, or candidates maybe who have have said racist things or sexist things or something. There are a few Republican candidates like that. That can make a difference, especially on the margins, but I think that the overriding factor will absolutely be, if the generic ballot is, say, 10 points redder than it was in 2020 at the end of the day, and you won your race by 9 points and you're a Democrat, I think apples to, or what's the phrase? Dollars to donuts, you are going to lose by 1 point.
Wonderful.
So does that also, sorry, for my own knowledge, so are you talking about the House specifically? Like it's everything for the House, not for the Senate?
Yes, I think it is probably 95% of things for the House. I think for the Senate it is important, but clearly for the Senate there's more room for personalities. People, I think, people might be aware of Herschel Walker's extracurricular activities in a way that they might not know their local congressmen's.
I was thinking just because there are fewer states in play.
Yeah.
So
right. And it's so subjective on which states are up and which year.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll take some questions. We have 2 students with microphones. Raise your hand if you have a question. Down here. We'll take this one here first and then in the back.
Thank you. I was wondering what your opinion is on what the Democrat play will be in 2022 and then going towards 2024 with Biden's approval rating being so low right now. And also, what do you think the behind-the-scenes rhetoric is within the Democratic Party, kind of the solution to that, and if it does go through Biden, or if it's kind of like a, avoiding Biden at all costs kind of play.
So I don't think we're at an avoiding Biden at all costs place yet. And we started to see moments of it, I think with Stacey Abrams had an event or said she had plans when the president came to town. I always laugh when that's the excuse any candidate gives. Like I had a prior engagement. It's like it's the president. So usually that's something worth watching. I think it's going to be tougher for incumbents to stay away from him. There's also, I think, a degree of loyalty. People like him. A lot of the kind of talking points that Biden has adopted has been pretty popular with the vulnerable Democrats that I'm thinking of. I think where it gets divisive is, with the more progressive members, and they tend to represent safe seats. So a lot of the vulnerable members, I was just talking about this a few minutes ago, I was talking about Tom O'Halloran,
Deep cut.
Yeah, in Arizona's 1st district. Everybody knows who he is, right? No. He is a Democratic congressman in Arizona who's whose victory could make or break, the House majority. All of them can make or break the House majority. But those are the kinds of members who are going to matter in 2022, and they generally tend to be adopting the same language as Biden. That's my observation so far. Interested in what you guys think.
No, you've probably been following it more closely than me.
I mean, I think the central tension for the Democratic Party is how far left is it going to go? And as Leah was saying, the most vulnerable members are in, generally speaking, districts that will not elect someone like Ocasio-Cortez, right? And so then what do you do in that situation? I think what's been so interesting about Biden's presidency is he did not run as a progressive. But when he came into office, I think particularly too, we forget in the sense that both the Georgia Senate runoffs, Democrats won, and kind of, later we see in 2021, of course, that Republicans do really well in Virginia, arguably do really well in New Jersey as well. But it was, a year that I know going in, our forecast had Ossoff's seat actually going to Purdue, and then we did have Warnock winning against Loeffler. But, we thought it was going to be a split scenario at best. And again, it wasn't like a handy victory, but it still happened. And I think that kind of put coattails against the Democrats going into power, because now they have a trifecta, they can pass things. We saw that they didn't pass things. And you can debate, what about Manchin? They still need Manchin, though. Like, if Manchin's not representing West Virginia, they don't have a majority. And I don't think Democrats have a satisfying answer right now for how to best meet different elements of their base. I think that's true for Republicans, though, as well. Leah was hinting at this, but you're seeing, for both parties, kind of a more extreme vocal wing that knows what they want, and they're not willing to moderate on that. And then you have a more centrist wing, increasingly smaller within the Republican Party, but they also don't want to moderate on things that are more progressive. And I don't really see an end to that stalemate, particularly given the geographic sorting. We just don't live next to people who think differently, particularly when it comes to politics.
What's the main cause of that?
Oh, interesting. The main cause of political sorting. I'm trying to think.
TV?
That's a big question.
That is a big question.
Probably can't answer it in one sentence.
No. I mean, I can speak to the erosion of it in the sense that, when we didn't have geographical sorting, you had more of a geographical coalition within the two parties. But as for the cause of it, it's more so, right, like urban city centers, that attracts more college-educated voters. But of course, college-educated voters haven't always leaned towards the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure why that has kind of glommed on to our culture war and our politics, and so much increasingly is tied to where you live. I don't have a good answer.
So we have another question, gentleman right there, yeah?
I had a question. What television sources do you follow to get your political news?
That's a great question.
I'm hearing a lot fake news in some of the stations. What are real stations you get your news?
Yeah, well, I will say I do not watch cable news. I find that, what's a polite term for it? Not educational. I would say, let's see, I like to follow a lot of kind of, I guess you would call them like smaller, nerdier outlets. So like the National Journal, where Leah used to work. I like to read Daily Kos on the left and Red Racing Horses on the right for kind of down ballot races. And then, I don't know, I guess the usual suspects, NPR, the New York Times.
You did follow NPR, and you watch the news at night and National Public Television as well, right?
No, I don't watch TV news really at all.
You get mostly from the radio, newspaper,
Hmm?
mostly from newspaper, radio.
Yeah, like I tend to read like online only publications or like the online version of newspapers like New York Times.
He likes baseball, so he's watching baseball games.
That's true, yeah.
No, and podcasts are also a big one, I think.
That's true. I'm actually not a podcast guy.
Follow Fox News or anything?
Not regularly.
Newsmax, another one. Follow any of those?
Not regularly, though a study did come out that a lot of Democrats are watching Fox News. I think the most important thing with any media diet is a balance. You should read those you don't agree with and read those you do.
All right, we have another question down here in the front. Microphone. Right here.
Thank you. I was just wondering if like electoral predictions have changed, or I don't know, or if they stayed the same since like the surprise 2016 election of Donald Trump. How no one really kind of predicted that happening. If kind of monitoring elections has changed since, or if it's
Ooh, 538's favorite question. No, I think, as in that election, as now, we really do try to stress the margin of error present in polls, that, if somebody has a 3 and 4 shot of winning, particularly as Clinton did in 2016, Trump still had a path to the White House. One thing too that is complicated is when you average all of the national polls together, both in 2016 and in 2020, it wasn't really like a huge abnormal polling error. But what was abnormal is, there are swing states, particularly in the Midwest, where the polls were not great in either of those elections. But then they were really good in 2018. So it's like, and Nathaniel's done a lot of work on this as well for the site. And the polling error is not predictable in which direction it's going to go. It varies from cycle to cycle, presidential to midterm. And I think, though, what is complicated and what we are seeing more is, part of the way in which we build our forecasts is correlations based on geography. That's one component. And trying to, make predictions on, okay, we know the electorate votes this way in New Hampshire, but they vote, this way in, actually Alaska's not a bad comparison. They both kind of have a swingy electorate, less, our term for it is elastic and inelastic. And so it's more of an electorate that's not necessarily going to vote, Orthodox Republican, because largely it boils down to both race, but then also religion, and there's not as much evangelical Christians in both of those states. But that is a long-winded way of saying that the polls are still all right. That's the big thing. But it is something, you need to go into understanding that if we show in our average or if we show in our forecast an 8-point lead, we're also showing you the margin of error within that. And you should expect a 3 to 4 point difference. That's not unusual. And also kind of realizing that, if a race is, 2 points between a candidate, it really is a toss-up. If it's 4 points, it really is a toss-up. And understanding that that is in part how polls
538 gives the St. Anselm poll an A, so I'm very happy with that. Because we call St. Anselm St. C's, so to get an A on this campus is hard. Okay, another question down here in the front?
Thank you. So in recent years, we've seen Republicans have some success running female candidates, and then we saw Sarah Palin just putting her hat in the ring, and people are looking at Kristi Noem as a potential presidential bid. Do you think we're going to see Republican women doing well in the polls this midterm year?
Well, in governor's races, I was just talking about this the other day. I mean, there is a chance that Republican women become a much bigger force in politics in the next couple years. We're seeing, I mean, I kind of want to wait till the primaries are finished. That's what I did, at least in 2018. Literally just went through every race and tried to figure out, you know, what a year of the woman would look like. I mean, at this point, so 25% of the House is female, 24 point something percent, or 25 now. So there's only so, I mean, let's say Republicans pick up 5 to 10 seats. Like, how much does that actually move, that 25% number? And you do see a bunch of open seats, so I think the question there is, you know, how many women come out of those primaries? So I know I'm not actually answering your question. It's basically, I know that Republicans like to recruit women. They're definitely looking for that. They went to, they realized that was a problem, especially after 2018 when, you know, the balance was so off between Democratic women and Republican women in the House. So I think it's likely we'll see growth. It's really hard to get a big number, even in the year of the woman, where, you know, it's a huge growth gets you to a quarter.
And 2020 was a really good year for Republican women, so yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's a good political environment for Republicans this year, it stands to reason, right? You would see some gains.
Okay, question back here in the red.
Yeah, I just have a question as far as what you think that the role of the January 6th Commission could have on midterms if something relevant does come out.
Do you want to go take this?
Oh, it's a great question. I think probably next to none. You know, it seems like, you know, if you look at the polling, you know, people have moved on from January 6th. I can't imagine that the commission will produce any particularly surprising results. You know, when you compare it to something like the Supreme Court's decision in, you know, the challenge to Roe v. Wade, which I think has the potential to be a lot more explosive. You know, I think in general, saying that any one issue is going to be the game changer in election is pretty dicey, and so, you know, and even this one I would put kind of low on the list. Yeah.
One thing we've been talking about internally is, you know, why hasn't there been more of a penalty? You know, and I mean, even in the day itself, I remember, you know, covering it and thinking, oh, surely, you know, the senators who are going to object to the count are not going to do that. No, sure enough, we went through the whole song and dance. But I think a lot of focus groups that various outlets, you know, are kind of conducting right now, when they talk to a room full of voters about like January 6th, they're like, what? Like, that's not the top issue. There are other things that they're thinking about. And we just haven't seen really like a penalty for that among like Republicans running for office.
We have a candidate running in the second CD who was convicted yesterday, being part of it, and he thought it was great that he was convicted so he gets the earned media out of it. Another question? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering, do you think there is a possibility of a shift in the voting habits of specifically Hispanic Americans in the future, maybe towards Republicans? Just because it seems that there's a lot of more conservative values amongst that community, especially if the Republicans sort of change their rhetoric.
Yes, I think Florida was the biggest surprise of the night for me in 2020. Everything else was like, oh, this is like a path. This was one path that could have happened. Florida in particular, making that kind of rightward lurch, I think Democrats are very aware of, and I think that's one of the big fears going into 2022.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, you know, I definitely agree. I think Hispanic voters are a swing group. You know, as you mentioned, there are kind of a lot of reasons, I think, for the Hispanic community to lean conservative. You know, kind of they're very invested in this idea of like the American dream, and you know, if you work hard, you can get whatever you want, and they don't, you know, they're kind of opposed to this, you know, like a lot of the elements of like the welfare state, for example. A lot of them are socially conservative, very religious. So there is a lot for Republicans to work with there. I do think it, you know, it depends, right, on the rhetoric, and I think that in 2016, you know, Trump's racist rhetoric was more kind of at the forefront, and in 2020, it was more about the coronavirus and economic restrictions that were coming along with that, and Trump was the, you know, he was the one who wanted to open the country up and get everybody back to work, and I think that Latinos really responded to that. And so I do think, yeah, I think there is a path forward for Republicans, and the messaging will matter in that regard.
Yeah, on that note, this was a piece from 2018, but the economy is often the #1 issue for Hispanic voters. And so if it remains in the situation where it is now, like that is not good for Democrats moving forward, and probably will edge more support towards Republicans. I think there's a broader question though of like, can the Republican, if college-educated voters are now increasingly Democratic, you know, will the reverse happen where more non-college educated voters are Republican? And we haven't seen that happen yet. You obviously have among white non-college educated voters. You've seen, you know, some of that happening, but like, will that continue? I think that's a big question we'll be looking at going into the midterms.
Another question? Yes, down here. I think we'll have time to get to everyone if you have questions.
Hi, we've seen some gridlock in the last few states that have yet to finish their congressional redistricting, especially in states with Republican trifectas. And I'm just curious to see how you think that stalemate plays out.
Great question, yes. A nice wonky question, love to hear it. Yeah, so the 3 states that have yet to finish redistricting, I bet you already know them, but for the rest of the audience, are New Hampshire, Missouri, and Florida. So here in New Hampshire, folks might be familiar with this, but Republicans in the legislature want to pass a map that basically does the biggest redraw in the last 150 years or so, changing the first and second district's configuration. Governor Sununu has supported something that's a lot closer to the current one. The upshot for the legislative map would be you would have one more safely blue seat and one more safely red seat. Sununu wants to keep both seats fairly competitive, similar to the way they are now. I would imagine that Sununu's way will win out. I think that like the status quo tends to, you know, like inertia is a powerful force, and the status quo, you know, it's like safer, and I think Sununu has a strong hand to play. You know, he's very popular. In Missouri, you have a situation where Missouri's been a word I can't say. The conservatives in the state Senate have really insisted on drawing the 7-1 Republican map, which basically eliminates a Democratic district around Kansas City, and they've filibustered every attempt to pass a kind of quote-unquote normal 6-2 map, which is basically would mirror the map as it is right now. And in fact, the candidate deadline, the deadline for candidates to run for Congress in Missouri has passed without a new congressional map. So people don't know where they're going to run. So it's really not a great situation there. That's probably going to go to court. I would imagine the status quo will win out there. The conservatives who have been filibustering for a 7-1 map are very clearly in the minority. But it will, I think, be up to a court to decide. Although I think in general, courts do tend to be kind of lowercase c conservative in terms of, you know, we're just going to make the fewest changes possible. And then Florida is the biggest question mark. This is a situation where the legislature has passed one map. Governor Ron DeSantis is insisting on a more aggressive Republican gerrymander. He is, you know, I think he really wants to prove his conservative bona fides and say that he fought for Republicans, you know, as much as possible if and when he runs for president in 2024. He vetoed the legislature's map. they say they're going to try again, but they kind of have this very fundamental disagreement about whether there's a seat in North Florida that's majority black, or I'm not sure if it's majority black, but it's black people are the largest racial group. DeSantis wants to get rid of that seat. He says it's illegal. He says that by kind of prioritizing race as a criterion in drawing that district, that is illegal and goes against Florida and federal law. But the legislature is like, no, it's pretty clear based on court precedent and stuff that this district is legally protected. I would guess that what will happen there is that the legislature's been very public about their position on this. I think it would be very hypocritical of them to just cave to DeSantis at this point. It'd be a huge victory for DeSantis if he got that. But my guess is they'll continue to stalemate, and then again, that will go to the courts. And then I think the courts, because they also have this history of upholding the black district in North Florida, will side with something more like the legislature's map. It's still a fairly friendly map to Republicans, but it's certainly not as, DeSantis's map would be absolutely phenomenal for Republicans. It would, that it would move the aforementioned, kind of the bias of the House. It would nudge it back toward the right. So yeah, I think I would say that something close to the status quo in all 3 states is the safest bet, but there is uncertainty for sure.
So I think we have time for one more. There's one more question right down here.
Yeah, I was wondering, how did you guys make your breakthrough in journalism? And at the same time, what is your advice to aspiring journalists?
They always have good questions.
I was going to say, my path was middle school teacher, then go into the business sector for a little while, and then find Ronald Brownstein. So I don't have a good, I don't know. I think that the general, advice that had been given for years was, start at a local paper and work your way up, and I think that's still a great path. There are just so many now. Usually my advice to people who want to be journalists is do not be discouraged. At least I think everybody who does journalism has been told you can't do this at least once or twice. So.
No, it is a hard field. But Leah's right, there's lots of paths. My path was data journalism, so not traditional reporting. You do reporting as a data journalist. A good data journalist asks questions of their data, but that was my path then. And it was more coding, analysis, building out graphics. For me, it was always the story versus like more news design and products. But that's a path within journalism. But I think as Leah said, right, don't give up. It's definitely a hard field that doesn't pay well at the lower end of it, which is true of other industries. I don't mean to just disparage journalism, but it's particularly bad within journalism.
Yeah, I had a very non-traditional path as well. I think even less traditional than you guys were. We're trying to do an untraditional out here. But I didn't think I wanted to do journalism. I worked for, as was mentioned in the introduction, for a bunch of places. I worked for the Red Sox. I worked for this research firm in DC, and was not very satisfied in all of these. But I really liked 538 and other news outlets, and I started a blog, and I started a Twitter account, and I started to share my posts on there, and eventually kind of they came to the notice of Nathan Gonzalez, who Leah and I used to work for together, and then I got hired at 538. And so I would say that I really found the benefit of freelancing and getting your stuff out there was big. So even if you are not doing journalism as your main job, writing articles regularly, practicing. I had my blog, but I also recommend, I wish I had just found out sooner, just submitting things and pitching things to places. So you can contact someone like Sarah, a politics editor at a place, and pitch them a story and try to get your name out there. And every place that you get published is a new credential to bring to another place and say, I'm legitimate, I promise. Reading the kind of journalism you want to emulate, and kind of learning by example and absorbing that. That was a big part of my path. What else? And you guys are still young. I very much regret not doing more journalism stuff in college. If there are journalism classes, or certainly extracurriculars, your local or school paper. Get those experiences. Do internships. It took me a long time to, by process of elimination, cross off things that I didn't want to do, and eventually was like, well, I like writing and I like politics, so I guess I should be a political journalist. Yeah.
Well, we here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics are in the democracy business, and so not only are we thankful that you came here tonight, but truly, we're very thankful that you've chosen this profession because it's vital, and with all seriousness. So thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Nathaniel, if you had tickets